I'm going to tell you a story so final, so stripped of everything except what matters, that it leaves nothing behind but truth. In the high Apache country, where the Ga'an still walk if you earn the right to see them, and where one man's mistake can make even the mountain spirits turn away. It starts with a single bead of water appearing on dry stone after a night of dancing alone under the moon. A drop so small it could mean nothing, or everything. A child watches. An old woman waits. And a man must choose between keeping his people's memory alive and keeping his place among them. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Makoa reached the spring at Chí'chil Biłdagoteel. Light came thin and pale, the color of old bones sliding across the oak leaves without warmth. He moved as he always had, slow, deliberate boot soles pressing the earth only enough to feel it give. The sharps rested across his back, familiar weight. But today, it felt heavier, as though the metal itself remembered something he tried not to. He knelt at the spring's edge. The water lay flat, mirror still, reflecting nothing but sky. No ripple, no sound. The oaks stood silent around him, branches hanging like men who had forgotten how to breathe. He dipped his fingers, expecting the usual cold bite against skin. Instead, the water felt wrong too, still too heavy, as though it had been waiting. A faint line marred the mud at the bank, a footprint half erased, smaller than his own. Not fresh, not old enough to belong to wind or rain alone. The shape carried the memory of someone who should not have walked here, someone whose name no longer lived in mouths. He knew the custom. Belongings burned, tracks scattered, names left unsaid. Yet the print remained pressed into sacred ground, like a refusal to leave. Makoa's hand hovered above the water. He did not touch it again. The air pressed against his chest, thick with the smell of wet oak, and something older dust raised by feet, long gone, the faint iron of old blood, dried into earth. He felt the land shift beneath him, not violently, but the way a horse knows a storm before the sky darkens. The Ga'an had not spoken, but their absence spoke louder than any drum. He rose slowly. Behind him, 30 paces off among the low oaks, the girl stood, small, barefoot, dark hair falling straight as rain. She had followed him again, silent as shadow. She did not move closer. She did not speak. Her eyes held no question, only the steady regard of someone who had already seen too much and understood it would not be explained. Makoa looked at her once, then away. The footprint lay between them now, a line drawn in mud that neither could cross without consequence. He felt the first small tearing inside himself, not fear exactly, but the recognition that safety had never truly belonged here. It had only been borrowed, and the debt was coming due. He turned back toward the wiki-up trail steps, measured rifle still across his shoulders. The girl remained where she stood, watching him go. Behind her, the spring held its breath. No wind stirred the leaves. No bird called. The land remembered. And it would not forget. The wiki-up smelled of dry cedar and last night's smoke, the kind that clings to wool and hair long after the fire has died. Makoa ducked under the low entrance boots, scraping the packed earth floor. Light filtered through the smoke hole in thin shafts, catching motes of dust that hung like ghosts, unwilling to settle. The air inside was close, warmer than the morning outside, but it carried no comfort. The old woman grandmother, to half the camp keeper of the old ways, sat cross-legged near the center fire pit. Her hands moved steadily, grinding corn on a metat, the stone rasping slow and deliberate. She did not look up when he entered. The girl sat beside her knees, drawn up small fingers, twisting a strip of rawhide. She watched Makoa, the way a hawk watches something it has not yet decided to kill. He lowered himself to the far side of the fire, back against the wicky-up wall. The sharps leaned beside him, barrel cool against his palm. He felt the weight of the morning still in his shoulders, and the spring silence heavier than any wind. She held it toward the firelight, studying it without expression, then looked back at him. No question in her gaze, only recognition. Makoa's throat tightened. He could speak now, could say he had seen the footprint that the spring had remembered, could admit the old violation the night he had buried his brother too quickly, two shallow belongings left unburned because grief had made his hands clumsy and the ground too hard. But words would open the wound wider. They would pull the ghost sickness closer, make it real for the girl, for the old woman, for the camp beyond these walls. He stayed silent. The fire popped once, sending a spark upward that died before it reached the smoke hole. The girl set the cloth down again, exactly where it had been. She did not wipe her fingers. She simply sat back, knees still drawn up, watching him with the same steady regard. The old woman resumed grinding slower now, each rasp of stone on stone sounding like a warning counted out. Makoa felt the first drag in his limbs, a heaviness that was not tiredness. His eyelids wanted to drop. His chest felt tight as though the air inside the wicky-up had thickened. He knew the sign. Ghost sickness did not announce itself with fever or pain at first. It came as weariness, as a body remembering what the mind tried to forget. He looked at the girl one more time. She had not moved. The cloth lay between them like a line drawn in the dirt floor. Outside, the wind had not yet returned. The oak stood waiting, and the heaviness in his bones settled deeper, patient, inevitable. The fire burned low at the edge of the sacred oak's flames, licking the night without hurry. Smoke rose straight up thick and gray, carrying the smell of dry pinon and the faint bitterness of green wood that refused to catch clean. Makoa sat apart back to a fallen log, knees, drawn-up hands resting open on his thighs. The sharps lay across his lap like an old promise he no longer trusted. The camp had gathered closer to the fire than usual, old woman, two younger men who rarely spoke. And the girl witness, curled near the warmth blanket, pulled tight around her small frame. No one sang tonight. No stories. Only the crack of embers settling and the soft rasp of breath in the cold. Makoa kept his eyes on the flames, watching them eat the last of the kindling he had brought earlier. He felt the heaviness in his bones again, deeper now, as though the earth itself had seeped into his marrow while he walked back from the spring. He told himself it was only fatigue. The land would settle. The wind would return. Things forgotten could stay forgotten. The girl coughed, once short, dry the sound, cutting through the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. She pressed a fist to her chest, then lowered it slowly. Her eyes found Makoa across the fire. They held no accusation, only the steady, unblinking regard of someone who had begun to feel the wrongness in her own body and did not yet know why. The old woman shifted. She had been feeding small sticks into the coals, careful not to let the fire flare too high. Now she stopped. Her hands rested on her knees. She looked at the girl, then at the ground between the fire and Makoa. A thin line of dust had drifted there during the day, fine dark carrying flecks of the same stained cloth from the wicky-up. It lay like a shadow that had crawled from the spring and found its way here to the place where children once played without fear. The old woman spoke, voice low, flat, the way one speaks to the wind when it will not listen. Land does not forgive violation of death. She did not look at Makoa. She did not need to. The words settled over the fire like smoke, heavy lingering. The two younger men glanced once at him, then away. They moved their blankets a hand's breadth farther from his side of the circle. Not far. Just enough. The old woman returned to feeding the fire, but her movements were smaller now, contained as though touching anything near him might carry the wrongness back to her. Makoa felt the shift in his chest, not anger, not shame exactly, but the slow recognition that the space around him had grown colder. He had carried the ghost trace from the spring without burning it away. Now it had followed. Now it touched the girl. If he spoke, if he named the footprint, the cloth, the hasty burial years ago, when grief had made him bury his brother with the blanket still wrapped around him, then the sickness would have a name, a direction. It would spread faster. The girl would be marked as close to him. The camp would have to choose purify the source or push the source away. He stayed silent. His fingers closed slowly around the rifle stock metal, cool against skin still warm from the walk. The girl coughed again, softer this time, but longer. She drew her knees higher, resting her forehead there. The old woman watched her without moving closer. Makoa rose without sound. He stepped away from the fire into the dark between the oaks. Behind him, the flames flickered on smaller now, feeding on what little wood remained. He found a flat stone near the grove's edge, knelt, and began to gather dry sage, small bundles enough for a private smudge. His hands worked steadily, but the heaviness pulled at every motion. He knew it would not be enough. Private purification never was when the land itself remembered. From the fire circle, the old woman's eyes followed him. She said nothing. The girl lifted her head just enough to watch blankets slipping from one shoulder. Her breathing came shallow, labored. Makoa struck flint to steel. The spark caught the sage. Thin smoke rose pale against the night. He drew it toward his face, then paused. The old woman still watched. The girl still watched. He let the smoke drift upward without finishing the motion. The sage burned on, curling into the dark. And the girl coughed once more, quiet, persistent, the sound of something small beginning to break. Dawn came without fanfare. Gray light seeping through the oaks like water through cracked stone. The air carried the sharp chill of night still clinging to the ground, mixed with the faint mineral scent of the spring and the dry rot of fallen leaves. Makoa walked ahead, moccasin silent on the path worn by generations. The girl witness followed a step behind clay water jug, balanced on her hip blanket draped loose over her shoulders. She had not spoken since the fire circle the night before. Neither had he. The sacred spring appeared through the trees, its banks low, now water reduced to a thin sheen over mud. No longer the steady pulse it had been. Makoa stopped at the edge, eyes sweeping the grass. The ghost trace had grown bolder in the dark hours, a ragged scrap of cloth, once part of a burial blanket, half buried among the stems, dark threads curling like veins against the green. It should have been ash, long ago. It should not be here. He did not point. He did not speak. He simply stood, letting the sight settle into the silence between them. The girl stepped forward to fill the jug. Her small hand reached down, brushing the grass aside. Fingers grazed the cloth. She froze. The fabric clung for a moment to her skin, then fell back. She pulled her hand away slowly, as though the touch had burned without heat. Her breath hitched once, twice, then the cough came deeper than before, rattling low in her chest. She straightened, face pale in the gray, light eyes, wide but dry. No tears, only the quiet shock of something inside her shifting. From the ridge above, the old woman watched. She had followed at a distance, unseen until now. She did not descend. She stood motionless among the oak's blanket-wrapped tight face, half-shadowed. Her gaze rested on Makoa, not accusing, only steady. The space she kept was wider than words could measure. Makoa felt the shift in the girl's regard. She turned to him, jug still empty, and for the first time, the steady trust in her eyes flickered. Not gone. Dimmed. She took a half-step back, putting the width of one small footprint between them. Her blanket slipped from one shoulder. She did not adjust it. The cough came again, short, insistent, ending in a shallow wheeze. He knelt beside the cloth. The fabric felt cold against his fingers, damp from dew, heavy with the memory of someone whose name no longer passed lips. He could crush it, scatter it, pretend the wind had done the work. Or he could leave it. Let the sickness follow its path. Let the girl carry it deeper into her lungs. Let the camp feel the weight of his silence. Either way, the land would know. Either way, blood would bear the mark. The old woman remained on the ridge. She did not call out. She did not move closer, only watched. The girl whispered, voice thin as the first light. Gusson, not here anymore. The words hung in the still air, small and final. Makoa's hand stayed on the cloth. He did not lift it. He did not let go. The spring reflected nothing now, but empty sky. The oak stood silent witness. And the cough came once more. Quiet, patient, drawing nearer to something that could not be turned back. The sun stood high and merciless at midday heat, rising in thin waves from the dry grass of the high plateau. No wind moved the oaks. The leaves hung limp, edges curled inward like old parchment. Makoa walked at the rear of the small hunting party, bow slung across his back, eyes scanning the ground for sign. The old woman led slow but sure, her moccasins pressing paths only she seemed to see. Two younger hunters flanked her, silent, their steps light. The girl witness trailed last, jug, empty now, blanket folded over her arm. Her cough came in fits, dry and persistent, each one ending in a shallow rasp that carried farther than it should in the still air. They reached the familiar hunting ground, a shallow draw where deer had always come at dusk, where antelope had grazed the sweet grass near the grove. The earth here should have carried fresh tracks, cloven prints, scat still dark and moist. Instead, the ground lay empty, grass, unbent, dust, undisturbed, except for the faint ghost trace that had followed from the spring. No sign, no life. Only the hollow quiet of land that had turned away. Makoa stopped. His hand tightened on the bowstring without drawing it. He felt the absence like a weight in his chest. The animals had not simply moved on. They had fled something older than hunger or season. The Ga'an had withdrawn. The land no longer offered. The old woman halted at the draw's edge. She knelt, fingers brushing the dirt, then rose without a word. She looked once at the spring in the distance, its banks now cracked and pale water reduced to a narrow thread that barely reflected the sky. She spoke, voice low, flat, carrying only as far as the nearest oaks. Land gives no more. The two hunters exchanged a glance. They stepped aside, widening the space between themselves and Makoa. Not sudden, not hostile, only deliberate. One adjusted his quiver farther from Makoa's side. The other turned his back slightly, scanning a different ridge. They did not speak to him. They did not need to. The distance said enough. The girl stood a few paces behind Makoa, closer than the hunters, but still apart. Her cough broke again, longer this time, ending in a wheeze that left her doubled forward, hands on her knees. She straightened slowly, face flushed beneath the pallor eyes fixed on him. The trust had thinned further. She did not step nearer. Makoa remained where he was, alone in the center of the empty grove. He could pretend the game had simply shifted, that tomorrow would bring tracks again. He could keep silent, let the sickness run its course, hope the land forgot. But the draw stayed barren. The spring kept shrinking. The girl kept coughing, and the hunters kept their distant eyes averted, already choosing survival over kinship. He felt the pull in his gut, not anger, not pride, only the slow certainty that silence would cost more than words now. The old woman had not moved closer. She watched from the draw's rim blanket wrapped tight against the heat she no longer felt. The hunters waited bows slack, ready to follow her lead. Makoa turned his gaze to the spring, far off its water, a thin silver scar against the dry earth. The oaks around him stood empty of birds, empty of shade that mattered. The girl coughed once more softer, as though the sound itself were tiring. He stood motionless in the center of the grove, bow still in hand. And the land waited patient for what came next. The afternoon sun slanted low through the oaks, casting long shadows that stretched across the wiki-up circle, like fingers reaching for the center fire. Smoke hung thick in the still air, the smell of burning cedar sharp and close, undercut by the faint sourness of sickness that had begun to settle over the camp. The old woman sat at the fire's edge, blanket drawn tight across her shoulders, despite the lingering heat. She had called them together without ceremony. No drum, no shout, only the quiet passing of word from one to the next, until the circle filled. Makoa entered last. He ducked under the low entrance of the largest wiki-up boots, scraping the packed earth. The sharps stayed outside, propped against the frame. No weapon belonged here. He took his place at the far side, back to the wall, knees drawn up. The girl witness lay near the fire on a folded blanket, small body curled tight. Her breathing came ragged now, each inhale ending in a wet cough that left her trembling. Two other children sat close to their mothers, faces, flushed eyes glassy. The sickness had spread quiet, but sure. The old woman waited until the last person settled. Then she spoke, voice carrying without effort the way stone carries heat, long after the sun is gone. Pollution comes from Makoa. Spring holds only drops now. If we do not purify, large Guyane leave forever. Land dies. No one moved. No one looked directly at him. Eyes stayed on the fire, on the ground, on the children. The silence stretched, broken only by the girl's next cough, long labored ending in a small gasp. She lifted her head just enough to find Makoa across the flames. Her gaze held steady even through the fever haze. No blame. Only the quiet knowledge that something had entered her body and would not leave easily. The two younger hunters sat farther from him than they had that morning. One shifted his blanket, another hand's breadth. The other kept his back half turned. Not anger, only the slow, necessary distance of men who knew the land would not feed them if the wrongness stayed. The mothers drew their children closer, blankets pulled tighter. No one spoke against him. No one needed to. Makoa felt the circle close in, not with hands, but with the weight of what had to be chosen. He could stay silent still. Let the sickness run. Let the camp decide for him, drive him out to save the spring, the oaks, the children. He would keep his secret, his shame, buried with the brother he had not honored properly. But the girl would carry it deeper. The spring would dry completely. The Ga'an would not return. Or he could speak. Name the violation. Admit the night he had dug shallow because the ground was frozen and grief had made his arms heavy. Admit the blanket left unburned, the name unspoken, even now. The words would open the wound wide. The camp would know. The old woman would judge. The girl would hear. And if the purification failed, if the Ga'an turned away, there would be no place left for him here. No blood. No land. Nothing. His hands rested open on his knees. The fire popped once, sending a spark upward that died before it cleared the smoke hole. He rose slowly. The movement drew every eye, though no one turned fully. His voice came low at first, then steady louder, than he had spoken in days. I will purify. The old woman looked up. Her face remained still, but her eyes sharpened. Must be the largest rite, she said. And if Guyane do not accept, you will not be Apache. The words settled like dust after a horse has passed. No one moved. The girl's eyes stayed on him, fever-bright, unblinking. Her cough came again, weak, wet, final in its smallness. Makoa stood where he was, firelight flickering across his face. The circle remained quiet. The sickness breathed in the smoke. And the old woman waited patient as the land itself for what would come when the sun rose. The moon hung low, and thin silver light spilling across the sacred oaks like spilled lead. No wind stirred the leaves. The grove stood still, branches black against the night sky, the air heavy with the dry scent of dust and dying grass. Makoa moved alone through the shadows, gathering what he needed without haste. Oak branches cut with his knife, the blade scraping wood in short, deliberate strokes. White clay from a hidden pocket in the earth. Red ochre ground, fine between stones. His hands worked in the dark steady, but each motion carried the weight of what might be lost. He built the small altar at the grove's heart-flat stone oak mask, shaped rough by his own fingers, painted in lines that followed the old patterns his grandfather had shown him once, long before the name was forbidden to speak. The mask felt heavy when he lifted it, wood warm from his grip paint, still tacky, smelling faintly of earth and iron oxide. He set it aside and knelt, spreading the clay in a circle around the stone. No fire tonight. Fire would call too much attention. The rite would begin with dawn, but preparation belonged to the dark. The girl witness had followed. She stood at the grove's edge, small silhouette against the moonlit grass blanket wrapped tight. She did not come closer. She did not speak, only watched fever-bright eyes fixed on him. Her breathing came shallow, ragged, each exhale ending in a faint wheeze. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. She had not walked straight since the wiki-up circle. Now she leaned against an oak, small hands, clutching the bark as though it might hold her up. Makoa glanced once toward the ridge. The old woman was there again, distant, motionless. She had not followed into the grove. She watched from outside, the sacred line blanket dark against the night, face half hidden. The camp had decided, let him try. If the Gan accepted the land, might breathe again. If not, the pollution would go with him. No one had said it aloud. They did not need to. He felt the final settling in his chest, not fear now, not the old heaviness of avoidance. Only the cold certainty that the line had been crossed too far. If he stopped, the sickness would take the girl. The spring would vanish entirely. The oaks would wither, and the name of his grandfather, the one he had buried wrong, would fade with the land itself. If he continued, the Gan might turn away. The rite might fail. He would be marked forever, the one who tried and was refused, the one who carried pollution even after the ash settled. No place left in the circle, no blood to claim him. He lifted the mask. Wood creaked faintly under his fingers. He set it over his face oak, pressing against skin paint cool and sticky eye slits, narrow, restricting the world to slits of moonlight and shadow. The weight settled on his shoulders, like a hand pressing down. He began the first slow step of the dance feet, bare on the earth, circling the altar without sound. No drum, no song yet. Only the soft thud of heel on ground, the faint scrape of moccasin leather, his breath steady behind the mask. The girl watched. Her lips moved, once barely a whisper, the name of an ancestor spoken only once, taboo forbidden. The sound died in the air before it reached him. She fell silent again, eyes wide in the fever light. The old woman remained on the ridge. No wind answered, no leaf moved. Makoa danced on slow circles under the moon mask, heavy heart steady. And the grove stayed quiet, too quiet, waiting for what the dawn would bring. Dawn broke cold and pale over Chí'chil Biłdagoteel light, creeping across the cracked bed of the sacred spring like a hand reluctant to touch. The oaks stood black and bare against the gray sky branches, rigid leaves long gone. No birds, no insects. Only the thin whistle of Makoa's breath behind the oak mask as he moved. He had danced through the last hours of night, slow circles around the altar stone heels, striking earth in measured rhythm. Now the first true light found him still in motion. Guyana steps heavy, deliberate arms raised in the old pattern his grandfather had once traced in the dirt with a stick. The mask pressed against his face would warm from hours of sweat paint, cracking faintly at the edges. Each step carried the weight of what he had carried alone for years, the shallow grave, the unburned blanket, the name he had never spoken again. He did not dance for glory. He danced because the alternative was silence that would swallow everything. The girl witness lay on a blanket near the altar, small body curled tight. Her fever had burned high through the night. Now she lay still, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven pulls. No cough anymore. Only the faint rattle deep in her lungs, the sound of something giving way. Her eyes half open followed him, fever bright, unfocused, but fixed. She did not speak. She did not reach out. She only watched. Makoa stepped wider, circling the dry spring bed. His moccasins ground dust into the cracks where water had once run clear. He dipped his fingers in the red ochre, drew lines across the flat stone lines for Usin, for white-painted woman, for the mountain spirits who had once answered. The paint smeared under his touch, thick and gritty. He sang low words, older than memory voice, roughened by hours without water. No drum, no echo. The sound died close to his throat. Then the wind came. One sudden gust, hard and cold, sweeping down from the ridge. It lifted dust in a thin veil, rattled the dry oak leaves still clinging, stirred the hem of the girl's blanket. Makoa paused mid-step. The mask's eye slits framed the spring still dry, still cracked the last thin sheen of moisture gone. The wind died as quickly as it had risen. No more followed. The oak stood still again. He felt the shift in his gut, not hope, not relief. Only the recognition that the gone had heard, and chosen not to answer fully. The girl's breathing slowed. One breath, another. Then a long pause. Her eyes fluttered, once then opened wider, finding him through the haze. She did not smile. She did not speak, only looked. Makoa finished the last circle. He stopped before the altar chest, rising and falling under the mask. Slowly, he reached up, fingers stiff, and lifted the wood from his face. Paint flaked away, falling to the dust like dry blood. He set the mask on the stone beside the lines he had drawn. The spring remained empty, but on the flat rock beside the altar, a single bead of water had gathered small, clear, trembling at the edge of a crack. It caught the first true light and held it for a moment before the sun burned higher. Makoa knelt. His knees met the earth. He placed both palms flat on the stone, fingers spread, feeling the faint coolness of that single drop against his skin. The girl watched him, eyes steady now, unblinking. No wind returned, and the silence pressed down, heavier than before, waiting for what the day would carry. The sun stood straight overhead, at midday heat, pressing down on the oaks like a flat hand. Light poured across the rhea of the grove, harsh and unfiltered, turning the cracked earth white and the leaves brittle brown. The sacred spring lay before Makoa, a shallow depression, now its bed dry, except for a small pool no larger than a man's palm. Water gathered there in a thin sheen, clear, but still reflecting nothing but sky and the faint shadow of his kneeling form. He sat cross-legged on the stone lip palms, resting on his thighs, the gone mask set beside him like a discarded skin. Paint had cracked and flaked away in the night's dance. Wood showed pale where fingers had gripped too hard. Sweat had dried in salt lines on his neck shirt, stiff against his back. The air smelled of hot dust and the faint mineral bite of the spring's last breath. No wind, no sound but the slow rasp of his breathing and the distant ragged pull of the girl's. She lay on the blanket he had spread earlier, small body, half-curled face turned toward him. Fever had broken sometime after dawn. Color returned faintly to her cheeks, but her eyes stayed heavy lids, slow to lift. She had not spoken since the whisper in the dark. Now she watched him with the quiet regard of someone who had walked close to something final and come back changed. From the ridge beyond the oaks, the old woman stood with two others' shadows against the glare blanket's dark. They had come as the sun climbed, stopping at the grove's edge. No one crossed the line. No one called out. They watched still as stones accepting what the rite had given a single drop of life returned to the spring, enough for one child to drink. Enough to keep the land from dying entirely, but not enough to heal what had been broken deeper. Makoa dipped a hollowed gourd into the pool. Water barely covered the bottom, cool against his fingers, tasting faintly of earth and iron. He carried it to the girl. She lifted her head without help, small hands closing around the gourd. She drank slowly, throat-working once, twice. A drop spilled down her chin. She did not wipe it. When she finished, she set the gourd down between them and looked at him. Her eyes held no question, only the steady weight of what she had seen. He felt the scar settle in his chest, not pain, not regret exactly, but the knowledge that the land had answered in part and withheld in full. The oaks remained empty. The Ga'an had stayed, but their presence was thin, distant. The camp would live. The spring would not run as it once had, and he would not sit in the circle again. Pollution lingered like smoke in wool. It could not be washed out. They had let him finish the rite to save the land. They would not let him stay to remind them of the cost. The girl reached out. Her fingers brushed his hand once light, then withdrew. No grip, no holding on, only the touch, brief and final. She settled back on the blanket, eyes closing slowly. Makoa remained kneeling a moment longer. Then he rose. The movement pulled at muscles stiff from the night's dance. He turned toward the high country beyond the ridge, dark, timber-distant peaks, land that did not know his name or his shame. No words passed his lips. No backward glance. The old woman and the others stayed where they were, watching him go. The girl opened her eyes one last time, watching too. And the grove held its silence, scarred but breathing, while the sun burned higher and the day moved on without forgiveness. The sun bled low across the western ridge, turning the sky the color of old iron and the oaks into black silhouettes against the dying light. Shadows stretched long and thin over the ria of Chí'chil Biłdagoteel. The grove thinner, now branches stripped bare by drought and time. The sacred spring lay quiet at Makoa's feet, a shallow bowl of cracked earth holding no more than a palmful of water, clear but motionless, reflecting the last red streak of day. No ripple, no sound but the slow scrape of his moccasins on stone. He stood alone at the edge, shoulders squared against the cooling air, the Ga'an mask resting on the flat rock beside him. Paint had flaked away in places, leaving pale scars on the oak wood. He reached down, one fingers brushing the mask's edge, rough, warm from the day's heat, then withdrew his hand. The touch was brief, final. He left the mask where it lay, offered to the stone like something given up without ceremony. The girl witness sat a few paces away on a low boulder, knees drawn up, blanket loose around her thin shoulders. She had walked here under her own strength, slow and careful. But the fever had left its mark, cheeks hollow, eyes large in her face. She watched him without blinking, small hands clasped tight around a fragment of oak bark she had picked up earlier, rough splintered, carrying the faint scent of resin and dry earth. She did not speak. She did not move closer. From the far ridge, no one watched. The old woman and the others had withdrawn at last, shadows gone back to the wiki-ups. They had seen the single drop return to the spring. They had seen the girl drink enough to live, enough to keep the land from complete death, not enough to call him back. The circle had closed without him. Makoa looked down at the water one last time. A faint breeze stirred light, almost nothing, lifting dust from the cracked bed, carrying the smell of parched oak and distant pine. The oaks remained empty of birds. The wind brought no song, no promise. The Ga'an had heard the rite. They had answered in part, not fully, not with forgiveness. He turned toward the high country beyond the grove, dark timber rising against the fading sky, peaks sharp and silent. The path lay open, unmarked, leading to land that did not know his name or his violation. Staying would mean living on the edge, guarding the spring from afar, carrying the pollution like a shadow no rite could burn away. Leaving meant carrying the memory of this place inside him, still Apache, but rootless, the land of his blood left behind. The girl rose slowly. Her blanket slipped to the stone. She stepped once toward him, small feet silent on the earth. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing his wrist light, as a falling leaf then fell away. No grip, no plea. She stepped back, eyes steady, holding the oak fragment close to her chest. Makoa met her gaze for a long moment. No words passed between them. He turned. His steps were slow, measured boots, scraping faintly against stone and dust. The grove fell behind him, oaks, thinning into open ground. The breeze followed, carrying the faint whisper of something distant, gone voices perhaps, or only the wind moving through dead leaves. Not blessing, not curse, only sound. The girl stood where she was watching him go. She did not follow. She lifted the Ga'an mask from the stone's small arms, wrapping around it, pressing wood to her chest. The mask's eye slits stared blankly toward the darkening east. Makoa walked on into the gathering dark silhouette growing smaller against the high country. No backward look, no sound but the soft crunch of his steps fading. The grove held its silence. And the wind whispered on, carrying nothing more than itself. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.